The classroom was silent, except for the rhythmic tapping of Professor Ethan Graves' pen against his desk. His sharp gaze scanned the room, daring anyone to disrupt his perfectly structured lecture. His reputation preceded him, strict, no nonsense, and utterly intolerant of carelessness. Students feared him, but they also respected his brilliant mind. And then there was Liam. Liam Walker had never been one for rigid rules. He was bright, sure, but organization? Not his thing. His notebooks were a mess, his backpack an explosion of crumpled papers, and his habit of running late was practically legendary. If there was one person who could push Professor Graves' patience to its absolute limit, it was him. It all started on an ordinary Wednesday morning when Liam, in his usual rush, burst through the door 5 minutes late. Again, he was barely inside when his foot caught on the edge of a chair, sending him stumbling forward. His books, his phone, his coffee, everything went flying, and right in front of Ethan's desk. The entire class held its breath. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if summoning every ounce of self-restraint. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "would you care to explain why my floor is now wearing your coffee?" Flustered, Liam scrambled to gather his things, mumbling apologies. Yeah, sorry, Professor. I just—" He looked up, meeting Ethan's piercing blue eyes for the first time. There was something intense about the way he stared, something that made Liam's stomach twist in an unexpected way. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Sit down and try to exist without causing a catastrophe." Liam nodded and hurried to his seat, but he could feel Ethan's eyes lingering on him for just a moment longer than necessary. And as much as he wanted to forget the mortifying scene, something about that glance sent a spark through him, one he didn't quite understand. What neither of them realized was that this ridiculous moment, this clumsy mistake, was only the beginning of something neither of them saw coming, something complicated, something impossible, and maybe something inevitable. After that embarrassing morning, Liam tried to keep his head down. He made a silent promise to himself. No more clumsy disasters, no more drawing attention to himself in Professor Graves's class. But avoiding trouble was easier said than done. It didn't help that Ethan seemed to have a radar for his every move. Whether it was calling on him during lectures, pointing out an error in his essays, or simply watching him with that unreadable expression, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested, or maybe studied. Still, there was something almost thrilling about it. Liam had heard the rumors about Ethan Graves before signing up for his class. The man was brilliant, but cold, respected, but distant. Some students swore he had no personal life at all. Others whispered that he had once been different, warmer, even kind, before something changed. No one knew what. Liam hadn't cared much about those stories before, but now he found himself wondering, what was it about Ethan that made him so guarded? What was he hiding behind that stern, controlled exterior? One evening, long after most students had left campus, Liam was struggling to finish an overdue assignment in the library. He had promised himself he wouldn't procrastinate again, but time had slipped away, like always. As he flipped through his notes in frustration, he heard footsteps approach. "You're still here?" Liam looked up, startled. Professor Graves stood beside the table, his expression unreadable. He wasn't in his usual stiff suit, just a dark sweater and slacks, making him seem different, almost human. Liam swallowed. Yeah, just trying to finish this paper before you decide to fail me." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I don't fail students for being late, Mr. Walker. I fail them for not trying." Something in his tone made Liam sit up straighter. There was no usual annoyance, no sharp-edged criticism, just quiet observation. "You always stay this late?" Liam asked, trying to sound casual. Ethan hesitated, then pulled out a chair across from him. Sometimes? Liam didn't know why, but the air between them felt heavier than usual, charged even, and for the first time, he saw something in Ethan's eyes, something unsure, something vulnerable, but before he could even begin to understand it, Ethan stood up, clearing his throat. You should finish your paper. And just like that, the moment was gone. Over the next few weeks, something shifted. Liam wasn't sure when it started, but he could feel it, an unspoken awareness that lingered between him and Professor Graves. It wasn't just the usual student-teacher dynamic anymore. There was something else, something that neither of them acknowledged, but both seemed to notice. Ethan still called him out in class, still gave him sharp looks whenever he turned in a rushed assignment. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where his tone softened. A brief pause before a lecture started, a glance that lasted just a second too long, an almost imperceptible sigh when Liam once again dropped his pen in the middle of an exam. It was nothing. And yet, it wasn't. Liam told himself he was imagining it, that Ethan was just naturally intense, naturally observant. But then there were nights like the one in the library, when their paths crossed outside the classroom, when the air between them felt heavier than it should. One evening, Liam was leaving campus when he spotted Ethan standing near the parking lot, deep in conversation with another professor. Something about the way Ethan spoke, his posture tight, his expression carefully guarded, made Liam slow his steps. He wasn't sure why he cared, but he did. The other professor, a woman Liam recognized but didn't know by name, sighed. You can't keep pushing everyone away, Ethan. Ethan's jaw tightened. I'm not. She gave him a knowing look. Then why do you look like you're about to run every time someone gets too close? Liam didn't hear the rest of their conversation, but the words stuck with him. He had always seen Ethan as unshakable, always in control. But what if he wasn't? What if there was more beneath the surface? Something that explained why he was the way he was? Liam should have left it alone, should have focused on his own life, his own problems. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more he found himself drawn in, watching Ethan, studying him the way Ethan seemed to study him. And for the first time, Liam realized something that sent a shiver through him. Ethan wasn't just looking at him like a professor watching a difficult student. He was looking at him like someone who saw too much, someone who was afraid of what he might find. Liam knew he was in too deep when he started noticing things no one else did. The way Ethan's shoulders tensed before speaking, the way his fingers hovered over his coffee cup like he was lost in thought. Liam had never paid this much attention to anyone before, but with Ethan, it was impossible not to. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something heavier. One evening, after another long study session in the library, Liam found himself walking toward the faculty offices. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way Ethan had barely looked at him in class that day, or the lingering tension he could no longer ignore. Either way, his feet carried him forward before his mind could stop him. The hallway was dimly lit, most of the offices already locked for the night. But Ethan's door was still open, just slightly, and Liam could hear the sound of low, uneven breathing. He hesitated. He could turn back. He should turn back. Instead, he knocked. A few seconds passed before Ethan's voice came, steady but quieter than usual. Come in. Liam pushed the door open, stepping inside. Ethan was sitting at his desk, his hand resting against his temple, as if a headache was threatening to take over. He looked exhausted. But the moment he saw Liam, something in his expression shifted, like a wall slamming back into place. What are you doing here? Ethan asked, his voice carefully neutral. Liam swallowed. He had no real excuse, no good reason, but he couldn't lie either. I don't know, he admitted. I just wanted to check on you. Ethan exhaled, a small, humorless laugh escaping him. Check on me? He shook his head. Liam, you don't know what you're doing. Liam took a step closer, ignoring the warning in Ethan's voice. Then tell me. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. His gaze locked onto Liam's, something unreadable flickering beneath his usual control. The silence stretched, thick with something neither of them wanted to name. Then, finally, Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. You should go. His voice was quieter now, but there was something else underneath it, something that sounded dangerously close to regret. Liam hesitated, his heart pounding. He could leave, pretend this never happened, but he wasn't sure he wanted to. Not anymore. Liam didn't move. The logical part of him knew he should, that Ethan had just drawn a line he wasn't meant to cross. But something about the way Ethan looked at him, like he wanted to take back his own words, kept Liam rooted in place. I don't think I want to go, Liam admitted, his voice quieter now. Ethan sighed, pressing his fingers to his temple. Liam, there was something in the way he said his name, like a warning, like a plea. But it wasn't enough to make Liam turn back. Then, suddenly, a sharp knock at the door cut through the moment. Ethan stiffened instantly, his entire demeanor shifting like a mask snapping into place. Without thinking, Liam took a step back just as the door swung open. Standing there was the same professor Liam had seen with Ethan in the parking lot, the one who had warned him about pushing people away. Her eyes flicked between the two of them, and something in her expression shifted, like she had walked in on something she wasn't supposed to see. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, her voice measured. Ethan straightened in his chair. Not at all. His tone was clipped, too formal, too careful. Liam felt out of place now, like he was standing in the middle of something much bigger than himself. He glanced at Ethan, waiting for some sort of reassurance, but there was none, just a carefully guarded expression that told him nothing. The woman's gaze settled on Liam, studying him for a long moment. Then she smiled, polite but not entirely warm. You must be Liam Walker. Liam blinked, caught off guard. Yeah. She nodded, crossing her arms. I've heard about you. Something in the way she said it made Liam uneasy. Good things, I hope? He tried to keep his tone light, but the air in the room felt too heavy for jokes. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her attention back to Ethan. We need to talk, she said, her voice firm. Now. Ethan barely hesitated before nodding. Liam, you should go. Liam wanted to argue, wanted to demand an explanation for whatever was happening, but the look in Ethan's eyes told him this wasn't up for discussion. So, with a quiet nod, he stepped past the woman and out into the hallway. The door shut behind him. Liam stood there for a moment, his pulse still unsteady. He had come looking for answers, but now he had even more questions. And one thing was clear. Whatever Ethan was hiding, it was bigger than either of them. Liam paced outside Ethan's office, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to walk away, to forget this ever happened. But he couldn't. Not when he was this close to understanding what was really going on. Minutes passed. Then the door opened and the woman stepped out. She barely glanced at him before walking down the hall, her heels clicking against the floor. Liam turned back to the office. Ethan was still inside, standing by his desk, his hands gripping the edge like he was trying to steady himself. He looked up, and for the first time, he didn't try to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. You're still here, Ethan said, almost like he was surprised. Liam stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. Are you going to tell me what's going on? Ethan hesitated, then exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. She's an old colleague. She's been concerned. Liam frowned. Concerned about what? Ethan met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Me? The answer shouldn't have surprised Liam, but it did. Ethan had always been so controlled, so precise, that the idea of anyone worrying about him felt strange. But then he remembered the way Ethan always seemed on edge, the way he carried himself like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Why? Liam asked. Ethan hesitated, then finally sat down. Because I used to be different, he admitted. Before. Liam's chest tightened. He didn't know what he expected Ethan to say, but it wasn't that. There was a time when I cared too much, Ethan continued, his voice quiet, and it nearly ruined me. Liam swallowed, his pulse unsteady. So you built walls. Ethan gave a small, humorless laugh. Something like that? For a long moment, neither of them spoke, but then Ethan looked at him, really looked at him, and something in his expression softened. You make it difficult, he admitted. Liam's breath caught. What? Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. Keeping my distance. Liam didn't know who moved first, but suddenly the space between them felt smaller, the tension heavier than ever. And just as Liam thought he finally understood everything, Ethan said the last thing he expected. I'm leaving, he murmured, at the end of the semester. Liam froze. He hadn't seen that coming. Not at all. And suddenly, the walls Ethan had built didn't seem nearly as strong as the ones about to come crashing down around them. Liam felt the words settle over him like a weight he wasn't prepared for. Ethan was leaving. Just like that. After everything, after the tension, the glances, the moments that felt like something unspoken but undeniable, he was leaving. He forced himself to swallow the lump in his throat. Why? Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair, his expression unreadable. It's time, he said simply. I've spent too long in one place. Liam hated that answer. It was too neat, too controlled, just like everything else about Ethan. But deep down, he understood. This wasn't a sudden decision. Ethan had been planning this for a while, probably long before Liam ever stumbled into his class, spilling coffee and disrupting his perfectly structured world. Still, it didn't make it easier to hear. Liam let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. So that's it? You just disappear and pretend none of this ever happened? Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Something conflicted in his gaze. I don't want to pretend, he admitted. The honesty in his voice caught Liam off guard. For all of Ethan's walls, his carefully constructed distance, there was something real in those words, something he wasn't used to showing. Liam exhaled, rubbing his face. You know, for a guy who claims he used to care too much, you sure have a strange way of proving it. Ethan actually smiled at that. Small, fleeting, but real. Maybe I haven't forgotten how entirely. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they weren't saying. Liam wanted to argue, to tell him to stay, to demand some kind of answer that made sense, but he also knew this was who Ethan was, a man who carried too much, who let go before things could slip away on their own. And maybe, just maybe, Liam had known from the start that this was never meant to last. Finally, he nodded. Good luck, then. The words felt strange on his tongue, but they were the right ones. Ethan held his gaze, something almost like regret flickering across his face. Then finally, he gave a small nod. You too, Liam. And just like that, it was over. Liam walked out of the office, out of the building, and into the night, the cool air hitting his face as he let out a slow breath. He didn't look back, because for once, he wasn't the one holding on to something that was already gone.